seated. I wonder if you've ever wished you could be a fly on the wall when something really important is going on. I'm someone who likes history, so thinking about being a fly on the wall when some of the important events in our nation's history, for example, were going on, sounds something very interesting to me, something I would like. Maybe to be a fly on the wall while Kennedy is making decisions about the Cuban Missile Crisis or something like that. Not too long ago, a lot of the tapes that were recorded by LBJ were released, and you can sort of get that feeling of what it's like to be a fly on the wall in the Oval Office. His secret tapes provide us insight into his actions regarding civil rights and the Vietnam War. Our epistle lesson from Hebrews chapter 9 is something like that. We can read the gospel accounts and read about Jesus' ministry on earth, but what it doesn't tell us in those gospels is explicit information about his ministry in heaven. And our epistle lesson today allows us to be a fly on the wall and witness his ministry in heaven. The writer of Hebrews gives us a chance to see Jesus in his priestly ministry, his act of redemption, cleansing you from sin as your great high priest with his own precious blood in the heavenly tabernacle. I want us to look at the epistle lesson today. I love the book of Hebrews, and we don't get epistle lessons from Hebrews near enough throughout the year. So if you give me a chance to preach on Hebrews, I'm going to do it. This passage gives us the opportunity to look at Jesus' ministry in the heavens and gain a greater appreciation for his ministry on your behalf. And it should also encourage you to take advantage of his ministry in heaven. Verses 1 through 7 of Hebrews chapter 9, which is not part of our epistle lesson, it provides context for our epistle lesson. And in it we are reminded of the construction of the tabernacle and the work of the high priest on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. And I want to read these verses to give you some context to our epistle lesson. This talks about Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Verse 1 starts, "Now even the first covenant had regulations for worship in an earthly place of holiness. For a tent was prepared, the first section, in which were the lampstand and the table of the bread of presence. It is called the holy place. Behind the second curtain was the second section called the most holy place, having the golden altar of incense and the ark of the covenant, covered on all sides with gold, in which was a golden urn holding the manna, and Aaron's staff that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. Above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot now speak in detail. These preparations having thus been made, the priests go regularly into the first section performing their ritual duties. But into the second, the Holy of Holies, the high priest goes, and he goes but once a year, and not without taking blood, which he offers for himself and for the unintentional sins of the people." So this passage is talking about the very regulated worship of the Old Testament. And it describes the regulations of that worship. A very specific structure was built, and all the details of the construction and the worship that would take place there were given by God to Moses. And this design was transferred from the tent in the wilderness to the temple that was then built by Solomon, and to the later temple constructed by Herod. The worship that took place from time to time, from the time until the Jews left Egypt, until the temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, this was what took place in the temple. This was the worship there. There was the outer court. Once you entered through the gate of the temple, you entered the largest area of the tabernacle, the outer court. It was accessed by multitudes of people. There was the brazen altar, and untold numbers of animals were sacrificed there. You can imagine, with all the sacrificing of the animals that took place there, the smells and the sights that were possible there. The laver was there, which was also used for ritual purification. And when you think of this, many times in the construction of our churches today, there will be the baptismal font at the front of the church, showing that we are cleansed when we enter into the church. And the laver was there at the entrance to this. And then there was the holy place. You know, there's a door is something that keeps things out, right? In this case, if you were to pass through that door, you would enter into a place no Jew could enter. Not even the Levites, the descendants of Levi, were able to enter this area. Only the descendants of Aaron were allowed to enter the most holy place. Only those who shared in the Aaronic priesthood. The holy place, you'd find the showbread, the golden lampstand, which you'd call a giant menorah. And there was also there the golden altar of incense. And this was the place where the priest ministered. It was the place where John the Baptist's father was ministering when the angel visited him and told him that John would be born. Another incident happened in that holy place, and that was Aaron's sons decided that they were going to get creative with the worship of God. And so Aaron's sons offered what was called strange fire. And Aaron's sons, for offering this unauthorized worship, were struck dead. These things happened in the holy place. And then we come to the veil. The veil marked the entrance to the most holy place, the Holy of Holies. Here there is only one person that could enter that place, and that person was the high priest. And not only was the access to the most holy place restricted to the high priest could only go in there once a year. He did his ministry in the Holy of Holies once a year. In that place, there was the Ark of the Covenant, the 10 Commandments were there, a jar of manna which was saved from the wilderness was there, Aaron's rod that budded was held there, the mercy seat which had the golden cherubim on either side was there, the place where God manifested himself in the Shekinah glory. When the high priest entered into the Holy of Holies, he was entering into the place on earth where God had manifested himself, his presence, more than any other place on earth. Moses was given detailed directions from God as to the design and the details of this old covenant worship, so that earthly worship, that design, was modeled after the heavenly. In other words, these things aren't something that no longer has a relevance. We know what the heaven realities are today because of these detailed instructions and prescribed practices of the Old Testament. A detailed account of the ministry of the high priest on the Day of Atonement, you can look it up, you can find it in Leviticus chapter 16. You can read it this afternoon. So what did that high priest do on that Day of Atonement, that one day he could enter into there? Our passage in Hebrews gives us a small taste, but he had a lot to do. The high priest would enter the outer courtyard, and he had to make sure all the animals were assembled. He'd need a bull and 2 rams and 2 goats. He then had to make the morning offering, and he had to ritually cleanse himself with water. And he laid aside all the visible glory of his office when he cleansed himself. He took a ritual bath, and then he put on just a simple linen garment, the garment of a priest. The high priest then went to the bull and made confession for his sin and for the sin of his whole household. And then he said the sacred name of God, Yahweh, Jehovah. Tradition tells us that when the people heard the high priest speak the name of God, they prostrated themselves, putting their face to the ground. Then the high priest cut the neck of the bull and collected that blood in a bowl. The next thing they had to do was the lottery of goats. One of the 2 goats was to be sacrificed to the Lord at the hand of the high priest. And that goat was chosen by lottery. Then the high priest got everything he would need to burn incense in the golden censer. And he took all of those things into the Holy of Holies. the place only he was allowed to enter. And there in the Holy of Holies, he burned incense till the whole place was filled with smoke. Then the high priest took the bowl with the bull's blood and entered to the Holy of Holies again. And he sprinkled the bull's blood with his finger 8 times, once toward the people in the mercy seat, and 7 times toward the Ark of the Covenant. And then he left the Holy of Holies, putting the bowl on a stand in front of the veil. Then the high priest repeated everything he did with the bull, but this time he did it with the goat as a sin offering. He took the bowl with the bull's goat and entered into the Holy of Holies again, and he sprinkled that blood of the goat with his finger. Now the high priest had a whole list of other things to do on the Day of Atonement, but this briefly describes what he did on that day. That is the work of the high priest on the Day of Atonement. But our text doesn't just tell us that Jesus did the work of an Aaronic high priest on the Day of Atonement. Our epistle explains why Jesus' work as a high priest is important to each one of us here. One of the things this passage teaches us, these services were performed in a temporary way until there was a better way. The better way included a better sacrifice. The high priest in Israel offered the bulls of blood and goats, of bulls and goats. Jesus Christ offered the blood of the sinless Son of God. I'm going to read a couple verses from our epistle. It says, Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come. Then through the greater and more perfect tent, that is, tabernacle not made with hands, not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by the means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience. So Jesus offered a better sacrifice. He offered a perfect sacrifice. He offered the only sacrifice that could truly cover the sins of man. He offered the blood of a sinless man. He offered himself a better sacrifice. But he not only offered a better sacrifice, he offered it in a better place. Our text tells us that Jesus didn't offer it in a copy of the heavenly things. He offered it in the original Holy of Holies. The heavenly place, a place not of this creation. Not the copy dictated to Moses. Jesus offered it in the Holy of Holies in heaven itself. So Jesus offered a better sacrifice, and he offered it in a better place, and he also was a better high priest. The high priest of Israel, of the Aaronic priesthood. But Hebrews tells us that Jesus, in fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecy, was a priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, we could preach a whole other sermon on Melchizedek, a priest of the Most High God and King of Salem, but we won't do that. But this is important to us in a couple of different ways. First, it tells us that Jesus' priesthood is greater than the high priest of Abraham, because the Levites themselves were blessed by Melchizedek through Abraham. So we know that the priesthood is a better priesthood. But here's something really important. Hebrews 7 explains that the priesthood is a priesthood without beginning or end. The priesthood of Christ is an eternal priesthood. The Aaronic priesthood was one that ended. So Jesus offered a better sacrifice in a better place, and his priesthood is a better priesthood. And that's important to know, because why? Now you have better access to God. Remember I said the high priest had to change clothes on the Day of Atonement? On the Day of Atonement, he laid aside his vestments and he wore the simple tunic of a priest. The very last material Jesus had during his earthly ministry was what? The simple tunic he had. That was the last thing he laid aside. He laid aside his simple priestly garment. He poured out his blood as a sacrifice for sin. The earth quaked and the veil in the temple was torn from one end to the other. That earthly temple is no longer there, and the barrier to the Holy of Holies is no longer there. Through the priesthood of Christ, each one of us has access to the mercy seat of God. You don't have to be a Jew. You don't have to be a Levite. You don't have to be a priest in the Aaronic priesthood. You don't have to be the high priest of Israel. No sacrifice of bulls or goats is required. You have access to the presence of God through Jesus the high priest. Anybody here have financial problems? You can take it to the throne of grace with confidence. What about addiction? Anybody here have addiction problems? Know someone with addiction problems? You can take it to the throne of grace through your great high priest, Jesus Christ. What about health problems? You have health problems? You can take it to the throne of grace through Christ. What about your struggling against sin? Maybe you're fearful. You can take it to Christ, your great high priest. Finally, our passage tells us something that's quite important. It tells us that Jesus' work as high priest is the way in which you can receive the promise of an eternal inheritance. We're talking about what happens after death. Is it your desire to receive the eternal importance, the eternal inheritance promised to the faithful in God's word? Is it your desire to be with God's people in heaven? It's only through the priestly mediation of Christ that your everlasting inheritance is secure. It was purchased by Christ. So have you placed your confidence in Christ? Are you trusting in his sacrifice and his mediation? The way that you show you look to Jesus as your great high priest is by making a public profession of faith, and by being baptized, and by looking to him in prayer. And in that special way you show your dependence upon him by feeding on his body and blood in Holy Communion. Amen.